Let's talk about one of the most famous protests in history, the Boston Tea Party. Now, it sounds like a nice, calm get-together, right? But it was actually a massive, defiant act of rebellion that literally helped change the world. And it all really boils down to this one question. Why would hundreds of people get so angry that they would purposely destroy a huge amount of valuable stuff? We are talking about 45 tons of tea. That's enough to completely fill a modern shipping container, just chucked right into the ocean. What could possibly drive them to do that? Well, the story starts where a lot of big arguments do, with money. After fighting a really long and incredibly expensive war, Great Britain was in some serious debt. So, to get its bank account looking healthy again, the British government decided to start taxing its 13 American colonies. But for the colonists, this wasn't just about paying a few extra coins. They were furious about how this whole decision was made. This famous slogan, it perfectly sums up their frustration. They believed it was just fundamentally unfair for a government to take their money in taxes when they had absolutely no say in that government. Okay, so let's break down what this idea of representation actually means. Imagine if all the rules for your school were made by people in a totally different country who had never even met you. That's pretty much what it felt like for the colonists. They didn't have a single person in the British Parliament to speak up for them, but that same Parliament was making these huge decisions about their lives and their money. That right there, that was the real problem. So this anger over taxes had been simmering for years, but it was one specific law, the Tea Act, that acted like a spark hitting a powder keg. It was a law that was supposed to solve a problem for a big British company, but it ended up creating a much, much bigger one for the entire British Empire. So in 1773, this massive company, the East India Company, had warehouses that were just overflowing with tea they couldn't sell. You can almost think of the Tea Act as a kind of government bailout. To save the company from going under, Parliament let it sell tea directly to the colonies at super low prices. And on the surface, hey, who doesn't love cheap tea? And this is where you can really see the two sides of the story. From Britain's point of view, they were doing the colonists a favor. But the colonists saw it as a total trap, like a Trojan horse. They figured it was just a sneaky way to finally get them to accept that hated tea tax, and on top of that, create a monopoly that would completely crush their own local merchants. So you can imagine when 3 ships loaded with this controversial tea sailed into Boston Harbor, the tension was just off the charts. The protesters, known as the Patriots, absolutely refused to let anyone unload the cargo. But the British governor, who was loyal to the king, refused to let the ships just turn around and leave. And here's the kicker. By law, the tax on that tea had to be paid within 20 days. The clock was officially ticking. This standoff obviously couldn't last forever. Something had to break. And on a cold night in December, it finally did, in the most dramatic way you can imagine. It's December 16th, the absolute last day before the tax was due. Thousands of people are packed into Boston's Old South Meeting House. The leader of this activist group, called the Sons of Liberty, a guy named Samuel Adams, finds out the governor isn't going to budge. So Adams stands up and says, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Now, that wasn't him giving up, oh no. That was the secret signal. It was time to act. And what happened next wasn't some chaotic, messy riot. No, this was a planned, disciplined, and organized operation. Hundreds of men, some wearing disguises to hide who they were, marched right down to the wharf. They split into teams, boarded the 3 ships, and got straight to work. They hauled up these incredibly heavy wooden chests, hacked them open with axes, and then heaved all the tea into the cold harbor water. And what's really important is that they were careful not to damage anything else, not the ships, not any of the other cargo. This was all about sending a very specific political message. And the sheer scale of what they accomplished that night is just staggering. In only a few hours, they destroyed 342 chests of tea. That's more than 90,000 pounds of tea poured straight into the water. All told, that is a mind-blowing 45 tons of private property completely destroyed. When the news of this finally reached London, the reaction wasn't, "Oh, maybe we should listen to them." It was pure, unfiltered fury. King George III and Parliament felt like they had been totally humiliated, and they decided that Boston had to be punished, severely. See, in the eyes of the British government, this wasn't a protest. It was a crime. It was a direct attack on private property and an open rebellion against their authority. And they figured if they didn't come down hard on Boston, they might lose control of all the American colonies. So, Parliament passed a series of harsh new laws that the colonists started calling the Intolerable Acts. I mean, just listen to this. They shut down Boston's port, which basically killed the city's entire economy. They banned most town meetings, which silenced the people's political voice. And they even passed a law that forced colonists to let British soldiers live in their own homes. It was a complete crackdown on their freedom. Britain's whole strategy was to make an example out of Boston. They wanted to isolate the city and scare the other 12 colonies into behaving. But that plan, it backfired. Spectacularly. Instead of being scared, the other colonies were outraged. They looked at what was happening to Boston and saw it as a direct threat to their own liberty, and it ended up uniting them like nothing ever had before. The Boston Tea Party and Britain's punishing response set off a chain reaction that just could not be stopped. What started as a protest over tea was now spiraling fast towards a full-blown war for independence. And just look at how quickly everything happened. You have the Tea Party at the end of 1773. By early 1774, Britain responds with the Intolerable Acts. That same year, the colonies get together for the First Continental Congress to plan how they're going to resist. And by April 1775, less than 18 months after that tea hit the water, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired. So the really important thing to remember here is that the Boston Tea Party was so much more than just destroying some cargo. It was this hugely powerful, symbolic moment that proved the colonists were willing to risk absolutely everything for their rights. For the relationship between Britain and America, this was the point of no return. And all of this leaves us with one final big question. The people who threw tea into Boston Harbor helped spark a revolution that created a new nation. It really makes you wonder, what does it take for a protest, for the actions of everyday people to truly change the course of history?